More than 9 million coronavirus cases worldwide, cases exploding in the United States, and more on the D614G mutation. We'll explain what that means and why it looks like that's going to be conferring additional infectivity as well as the possibility of explaining some of the secondary infections that we've been seeing. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Chris Martenson. I am here with your update on SARS-CoV-2. It's June 23rd, 2020. Let's go right to the numbers. Hey, we are nearing 10 million cases. We may well be over 10 million by the time I record the next video in a couple of days. This is yesterday's numbers. I think we're at 9.3 right now worldwide. Big explosion in cases. This is one of the largest daily increases that we've seen in the series. The United States, over 31,000 cases yesterday. Brazil coming in strong here with 24,000 cases. India, unfortunately, marching into the fray with this. India was doing a really good job keeping this all contained, but of course, looks like they are now joining along with everybody else with the cases. And of course, this is very, very difficult to control in places like Brazil, like India, like Pakistan, like Bangladesh, places like this where you have people crammed pretty tightly into areas. And as well, we see Saudi Arabia coming up here with lots and lots of cases, and their explanation may well be that they live, generally speaking, in air-conditioned situations and buildings and things like that, where it looks like the honey badger virus does like to spread through air conditioning and things like that. So lots and lots of cases going on right now. The United States still sitting at now just a little over a million recovered, and we're going to talk about why we think recovered doesn't really mean recovered. So let's jump right into some of the U.S. data. Looking here, the U.S. is really slip-sliding away here. Surging U.S. virus cases. They raise fear that progress is slipping. Well, I don't know what progress really honestly had been made. People were certainly beginning to social distance and do all of that, but then somehow mask wearing became a politicized event. It's the only country I'm aware of where masks and the wearing of masks is a political event for people and confers something about your political status, whether you are or are not wearing a mask. So I don't get it because it's just science and health and stuff like that. It just involves germs and the honey badger virus, which doesn't really get that. You know what? It doesn't care what your politics is. Honey badger virus, don't care at all. So looking at this article here in AP, they say alarming surges in coronavirus cases across the U.S. South and West raised fears Monday that the outbreak is spiraling out of control and that hard-won progress against the scourge is slipping away because of resistance among many Americans to wearing masks and keeping their distance from others. Yep, it could be that. I think that's certainly a big factor. But as well, I do believe the protests are going to be showing up in another week or two. We're going to start really seeing the protests show up in the data if it's going to. Confirming predictions that the easing of state lockdowns over the past month and a half would lead to a comeback by the virus. Cases surpassed 100,000 in Florida. Hospitalizations are rising dramatically in Houston and Georgia. In a startling 1 in 5 of those tested in Arizona are proving to be infected. All right, so we're going to get into some of that Houston data in just a second. But this whole idea that Florida is now surging in the south of the United States is full-on summer down there. So this whole idea that we were going to get a summer lull because maybe the virus disappears for summer and goes away, we can just put that to bed. That is no longer an idea we're working with. There is no fall wave coming. There's just this first wave that we're surfing along here right now. Over the weekend, the virus seemed to be everywhere at once. Several campaign staff members who helped set up President Donald Trump's rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, tested positive, as did 23 Clemson University football players in South Carolina. And that's unfortunate when we'll talk about how this honey badger virus can really harm your long-term prospects, it seems, in terms of your athleticism. So we'll see how that, all best wishes to Clemson University there and their players, but we'll see how this turns out. At least 30 members of the Louisiana State University team were isolated after becoming infected or coming into contact with someone who was. Meat packing plants were also hit with the outbreaks. Of course, meat packing plants, like churches, very good place to spread this thing for different reasons. Meat packing plants probably because the environment and they're cool and moist. Very, very favorable to and also people working very close together. Very, very favorable for transmission of the virus. And churches, because singing seems to be a really good way to spread this around. Something about opening your throat wide and vibrating the old vocal cords there. Seems to be really good at spreading it, which is why I'm a little concerned about those protest marches, because that had a lot of shouting. And shouting and singing, not all that different in some cases in terms of how it sounds, and I'm sure not the effect of it spreading virus. It is snowballing, they continue here. We will most certainly see more people die as a result of this spike, said Dr. Mark Boom, CEO and president of Houston Methodist Hospital. Okay, noting that the number of COVID-19 hospital admissions had tripled since Memorial Day to more than 1,400 across 8 hospital systems in the Houston metro area. So let's look here a little bit more general, specifically at Texas. Here's an article that says Texas is heading down a dangerous path. Local leaders warn as coronavirus cases and hospitalizations surge. Reading here, it says Texas's coronavirus cases and hospitalizations continue to break records for a second straight week. Leaders and health experts in the largest cities are warning that the state is heading down a dangerous path, and hospitals could soon be overwhelmed. That's the thing you really want to avoid. You don't want your hospitals to become overwhelmed. That's when people die unnecessarily for all sorts of things, COVID and not COVID. You really want to avoid that. Governor Greg Abbott struck a more urgent tone Monday, calling the increases in hospitalizations and cases across the state unacceptable. He said the state would only shut down businesses again as a last resort, but cautioned that if trends don't reverse in coming weeks, he'd be forced to take actions. All right, Governor Greg Abbott, how exactly are you proposing that these trends would reverse in coming weeks? All on their own? That's option A. Option A is they just do it all by themselves, so we just watch them. Option B would be because you did something and you took some steps and you asked people to do something new and different. Option C, I guess, would be because you closed the state back down again. But there is an option in here that works really well, Governor, and that's that you ask people to wear masks, and you make sure that they do. You make it a carrot and a stick kind of a thing, right? We'll open up. You can go back to Applebee's and have margarita night on Friday. I know that's what you all want to do if you wear masks. And if you don't get that, right? Oh, and there's a fine if you're caught out in public without a mask. That would be the carrot and stick approach, right? Applebee's and or a fine, right? The carrot and the stick. Okay, to state the obvious, COVID-19 is now spreading at an unacceptable rate in Texas, and it must be corralled, he said. Okay, here's what unacceptable looks like in graph form. Let's just check this out and get rid of this thing because we don't need that title box there. Yeah, you can clearly see this huge surge. This is starting to look case, cluster. It looks almost like boom state is going to be happening here soon. So this is a pretty big upsurge here in Texas. And even more specifically, focusing way down at the micro level, let's go to Houston. Houston has a problem right now. Never reported these types of numbers. Turner reports highest number of COVID-19 cases in Houston. Here's the article. It says, new coronavirus cases in Houston have seen unprecedented highs in the past few days, with Mayor Turner announcing Monday he had more than 1,700 cases to report. The disappointment for me, he says, is that all the good work that we did collectively in March and April and in May, with all the good work we did, shutting down, closing conferences and conventions, with all that good work, we're all engaged in opening and activities that are wiping away the success that we collectively achieved. I never reported these types of numbers before. We are moving very fast, and we're moving very fast in the wrong direction. And so here's, I think it's good for the Mayor Turner here to at least be getting down to what I consider to be reasonable precautionary information, which is to prevent a big setback. He said the best thing people can do is put on a mask and follow in lines with the order. He warned that those who are going to bars and clubs with no masks need to understand that just because you don't have symptoms does not mean you aren't carrying the virus. Exactly right. That's why we wear masks. 3 reasons. 1, because you don't know if you've got it or not. So I wear my mask to protect you. You wear your mask to protect me. Reason 2 is with the mask, we're going to be putting fewer of those virus particles out into the atmosphere if we do happen to have them in our body. Therefore, we're putting a lower load, a lower inoculum out there so that if somebody does come across this thing and somehow catch it, even though they're wearing a mask, our mask filters it, their mask filters it a little bit more, so they start with a lower load. That gives a better disease outcome starting with a small viral load. All right, so masks work. All right, Florida, what can you say about Florida? It's always marching to its own drummer, and Florida if you're not familiar, in the United States, Florida's got a little bit of a reputation for just the goofiest things and doing strange stuff and people behaving weird, right? Florida man is a thing. If you don't know about that, Florida man, if any article that starts Florida man is always going to be an interesting one. You don't know. It might involve alligators or shopping carts. You never know, right? It's always fun. But Florida's clearly having trouble here. And this article writes, with the state reopening and more testing in the state, we've seen an increase in reported COVID-19 cases. Florida now has reported over 100,000 coronavirus cases, and thousands have no idea how they contracted the virus. The spread began with travel, then contact with travelers. Now many are not able to trace how they got the virus at all. Data Florida Department of Health released Monday shows that more than 50,000 people can't pinpoint how they contracted the coronavirus or who spread it to them. I think it's kind of odd that you don't know where you've gotten it from, said Laura Thomas in Lehigh Acres. It's very hard to find where you can get it from because there are people who can be asymptomatic and not know where they get it from. All right, so here's the thing. In some countries, like New Zealand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, you would know exactly who you got it from because they actually do contact tracing. But this article I think really illustrates where the United States is in all this. We're at the shrug your shoulders and throw up your hand stage, right? Do both of those at once. Yeah, what are you gonna do, right? So there's really no attempt to understand where or how people are getting this. And I think the idea here is it's just the cat is so far out of the bag. We're never going to be able to figure that out where people got it from. So what are you going to do, right? So, but this article is just the Florida shrugging its shoulders thing. All right, and let's check in how Sweden doing to look somewhere in Europe real quick. Sweden tries out a new status, according to this New York Times article, Pariah state. Fearing the country's lax approach to combating the coronavirus, Sweden's Scandinavian neighbors have all closed their borders to Swedes. Ouch, that's got to hurt because for the Swedes, they really like their they like to be seen socially as welcomed and gracious and all of that. This must really sting for the Swedes, I bet. Long considered the lucky holders of one of the best passports for seamless global travel, Swedes now find themselves with few options for moving about the European Union. Most countries in the bloc have reopened their borders to member nations, but only France, Italy, Spain, and Croatia are welcoming Swedes without restrictions. Hey, good luck with that, France, Italy, Spain, and Croatia. Good luck, because remember, step one of gold standard pandemic response is halt the inbound infections. That's step one. 1A, in fact. In several countries like the Netherlands and Cyprus, they are banned completely. Austria demands a health certificate. Greece makes Swedes quarantine for at least a week, even if they test negative for the coronavirus. While the emergency laws and strong travel advice have upset many Swedes, nothing has been more painful than the behavior of their neighbors, said Ann Lind, Sweden's foreign minister. It's sad and frustrating that regions on the borders were so easy to close, said Ms. Lind. She pointed to southern Sweden, where coronavirus infections were much lower than in bordering Denmark. Nevertheless, she said, suddenly there were border guards on the bridge connecting the two countries. It will take time to heal. It was too harsh, she added. It's very difficult to understand. There were far more deaths in Copenhagen. Well, it's not really that hard to understand, Ms. Lind. It's just if you're battling an infection, I guess the last thing you want is to have more potentially coming across your border. That can make sense all on its own, has nothing to do with whether they've got more than you, has nothing to do with that at that point in time. But Sweden is facing a much, much higher death rate than in other countries, other Scandinavian countries. So I think Sweden's a little over 5,000 deaths at this point in time, and some neighboring countries are still in the low hundreds. All right, so I kind of get it. Remember, 4 weeks ago, George Floyd died in police custody, and that was on May 25th. So that's today is June 23rd. So we're about 4 weeks ago into that. And remember, on June 9th, I said in 3 to 5 weeks, we're kind of going to know if the honey badger virus has left. You know, a lot of charts were pointing down on June 9th when I put that up there. Here we are a week and a half after that, and now we're starting to see upticks in a variety of states across the West and the South in the United States. But the protests, if the protests were spreading events, That, I think, is not even in the data yet. That's not even part of those upticks that we're seeing. Those are really just due to the relaxing of the restrictions and or the cultural capital that exists in places where people either will or will not adhere to mask wearing, are either better at it or worse at it than other places. I think that's mostly what we're seeing right now as a litmus test of which states have citizens who are willing to wear masks. Because guess what? It's that simple. You wear masks and this whole thing kind of goes away. All right. At any rate, so if the protests were spreading events, and I think they're going to be, that's going to show up kind of between now and the second week of July. So these next couple of weeks are really going to be really key when we are looking at the data around that. Remember last time I talked about this Dallas woman was battling the coronavirus again. And so I want to talk about why that might be right now. And here we're going to get into something called the D614G mutation. All right, this is back in the news. Hey, John Mihokovich, thank you very much for bringing my attention to this and writing to me on Twitter saying what's going on with this D614G mutation here. Chris, a lot of new cases here in Florida, many other places. Seems like it's learning how to infect better. And we got to go to this article here, which talks about how approximately 70% of COVID-19 samples globally now show the substantially more infective and apparently infectious D614G strain of SARS-CoV-2. All right, what is that D614? So that's, let me decode that. The D is aspartic acid and the G is glycine. Those are two amino acids that exist at the 614 position on a very long string of amino acids. So position 614 used to be aspartic acid, but then it switched and became glycine. That was a mutation. It was a single point mutation where one amino acid was swapped out and became a different one. And because of that, it seems to have much, much higher infectivity and infectiousness. So imagine that, a single point mutation where one amino acid became a different one seems to be able to have conferred a much, much greater degree of infectivity to this. So here's the data that's coming out now. We've got two big pieces of it. This first comes out of a paper that's not yet been peer-reviewed, but it's in peer review right now. So we're getting kind of a preprint view of this thing. It says mutated coronavirus shows significant boost in infectivity. Here is the big giant, this is the S protein right here. This is the spike protein that would be all over the outside of the virus particle, and it's in here are the receptor binding domains and the S2 subunit, which needs to be proteolytically cleaved. And fortunately, there's a polybasic furin cleavage site right there at the S1, S2 boundary. Kind of interesting how that got there. People should ask, hey, where did that polybasic furin cleavage site come from? That's an interesting question. But we're going to leave that one aside because right now we're talking about the D614G mutation. And this article reads, a tiny genetic mutation in the SARS coronavirus 2 variant circulating throughout Europe and the United States significantly increases the virus's ability to infect cells. Lab experiments performed at Scripps research show. Viruses with this mutation were much more infectious than those without the mutation in the cell culture system we used, says this virologist here. The mutation had the effect of markedly increasing the number of functional spikes on the viral surface, she added. Those spikes are what allow the virus to bind to and infect cells. So functional spikes. It increased the number of functional spikes. So not all the spikes apparently are functional, but because of this mutation, many, many more of them are markedly increased. More of them are. The number or density of functional spikes on the virus is 4 or 5 times greater due to this mutation. So if the 4 to 5 times more spikes are functional, that means there's a much greater chance that when that virus is sort of wobbling around in you know the liquids in your body, that it will bump into and be able to latch onto one of the many receptors it seems to be able to latch onto, which includes neuropilin now, we've got the CD147, and of course ACE2, and probably some others. This thing is just really quite a beast because it tends to bind to so many different receptors. And that, I think, is in part why we're going to get into some of the disturbing data that's coming up now about how it's very hard to get rid of this completely once you've had it. All right, the spikes give the coronavirus's crown-like appearance and enable it to latch onto target cell receptors called ACE2, as I mentioned some other ones too, right? The mutation called D614G provides greater flexibility to the spike's backbone, explains co-author Michael Farzan, co-chairman of the Scripps Research Department of Immunology and Microbiology. More flexible spikes allow newly made viral particles to navigate the journey from producer cell to target cell fully intact, with less tendency to fall apart prematurely. All right, that's new to me. I didn't know that viral particles fell apart prematurely. So I guess they get inactivated somehow. So falling apart, I guess, is part of that. I'm going to have to look into that. I don't know anything about that. But at any rate, while the virus particle is infectious or infective, then these new spikes seem to make it allow it to journey much more rapidly somehow. Our data are very clear. The virus becomes much more stable with the mutation. I guess that Hyer Cho says here for this. That's the lead author. But Farzan and Cho note a key structural difference between spike proteins on the first SARS virus and this new pandemic strain. With both under an electron microscope, the spike has a tripod shape with its 3 segments bound together at a backbone-like scaffold. But SARS-CoV-2 is different. Its tripod is divided into 2 discrete segments, S1 and S2. Initially, this unusual feature produced unstable spikes, Farzan says. Only about a quarter of the hundreds of spikes on each SARS-CoV-2 virus maintain the structure they need to successfully infect a target cell. With the mutation, the tripod breaks much less frequently, meaning more of its spikes are fully functional. All right, that's cool. So that makes a lot of sense to me. So there's a conformational shape of the spike proteins, and with this mutation, it's just more stable. It just happens to persist in the shape it needs to in order to latch on to the target cell. So that's an interesting finding right there, and we're finding more and more about this virus all the time, and I think we're going to continue to learn about it, and I think we've got both some pleasant and unpleasant surprises in store for us as we go forward. Pleasant would be things where we learn how we can inactivate it, how we can treat for it, how we can really reduce its impact on the human body once it gets in there. The unpleasant surprises are going to be potentially what the long-term impacts are and things like that. The addition of the D614G mutation means that the amino acid at that location is switched from aspartic acid to glycine. That renders it more bendable, Farzan says. Evidence of its success can be seen in the sequence strains that scientists globally are contributing to databases including GenBank, the Duo report. In February, no sequences deposited GenBank database showed the D614G mutation, but by March, it appears in 1 out of 4 samples, and in May, it appeared in 70% of samples. Over time, it has figured out how to hold on better and not fall apart until it needs to. The virus has, under selection pressure, made itself more stable. All right, we talked about the D614G mutation a month and a half ago. I forget, sometime when it first started to show up back in March, and we didn't know a lot about it. The questions at the time were, listen, was there any, it's an interesting mutation, but was it associated with any additional clinical severity or different clinical outcomes? And we didn't have any data around that. We're starting to get a little bit of data sneaking in now. This comes from Thailand Medical News, maybe a little bit strong language here, a little alarmist maybe, saying, warning, the D614G mutation coronavirus strains from Europe could render those recovered from earlier strains defenseless, according to China. All right, let's read in on this. This article reads, according to warnings from Chinese researchers, individuals infected with the earlier SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus strains, we'll call those COVID classic, could be defenseless against the more aggressive European strains with the D614G mutations. This would have implications. Oh, yeah. Oh, look at this cool picture. I don't know what this has to do with anything. Excuse me. But I left it in anyway because it's got DNA in it. Everything's cooler with DNA. All right. This would have implications for countries like Japan, South Korea, most of the Southeast Asian countries, and even China itself, as most of the individuals infected in the early parts of the crisis were infected with the middle strains. The Chinese researchers say that the antibodies found in blood of individuals who have fought disease previously failed to stop the D614G strain. The mutant form was identified in genetic data of samples collected at Xinfadi Food Market in Beijing, where the latest outbreak just began. Chinese authorities are saying that previously recovered COVID-19 patients in China may still be vulnerable to a mutant form of the pathogen spreading overseas. All right, now we have some data now maybe for why China reacted so strongly to the Xinfadi Food Market outbreak in Beijing. They canceled thousands of flights. Just a huge testing program going on, lots and lots of contact tracing. China just doesn't want this strain or any strain of COVID to take off again. But I think they're a little bit worried about the D614G strain in particular, because they did identify it pretty rapidly there. All right, so that makes more sense now, how and why China reacted so strongly to this as well. All right, this is from the same article here. This continues. Professor Dr. Huang Ailong from the Chongqing Medical University said that there's an urgent need to determine what threat the mutation, known as D614G, poses to people who have recovered from a different form of the virus. Also worrisome is that the new strain could actually be more worse the second time around in patients who were previously infected with the milder strains and have recovered, but there is no clinical proof of this yet. No clinical proof, so that's just supposition at this point. The strain with the D614G mutation began spreading in Europe in early February and May, dominant strain around the world now, and is now present in India, Iran, Middle East, Brazil as well. Chinese researchers say antibodies found in patients who had been infected with the earlier forms of the pathogen failed to neutralize this new mutant strain. All right. Ever since the latest coronavirus outbreak was reported at the Xinfadi wholesale market in Beijing, 228 new infections have been confirmed and more than 2.2 million residents have been tested for COVID-19 in a bid to contain the spread. Look at the reaction on that. 228 new cases, 2.2 million residents then get tested. That's just astonishing because, I don't know, what's the other way you could do this? I don't know. Maybe, who knows? 50,000 people don't even know how they got this thing. Who knows? What are you going to do? Impossible. Can't be done. But apparently it can be done. This is how China does it. I'm not saying that's the right way, but it is possible. So that's just showing you also how seriously China is taking this, with 2.2 million residents tested because 228 new cases came in. Here's the punchline for this article, why I wanted to get all the way to here. Roughly about 12% of the individuals infected by the new outbreak in Beijing are in a critical condition, according to the Beijing health authorities, and medical teams from across the country have been flown in to help with the aid effort. 12% of the individuals are in a critical condition. So that's pretty important information right there. All right. So this is starting to fit a larger pattern, which looks like this, that we're seeing slow or no recovery for many people. So this just came out very recently. This is in the Times of Israel. Recovered COVID-19 patients suffer major ongoing physical and cognitive problems. Article reads, as coronavirus patients recover from the illness, doctors and patients are discovering that COVID-19 is leaving the, quotes, recovered with long-term debilitating physical, cognitive, and psychiatric damage, and sometimes even in people who only suffered mild symptoms. Patients are suffering from phantom pains, memory loss, personality changes, psychological issues, and extreme fatigue, along with lungs that won't heal, even months after being discharged from hospital, according to an investigation by Israel's Channel 12 TV. Let's continue on here. Afik Suissa, 24, was one of Israel's youngest patients to be hospitalized. Only 24, huh? And ventilated in serious condition, a resident of the southern port city of Ashdod. Suissa was hospitalized at the end of March. He had recently been in the U.S. with two friends touring Miami and then Las Vegas. The three returned to the country, and Suissa immediately went into home quarantine in accordance with health ministry guidelines, but he quickly developed a fever that became worse and was hospitalized. Within days, his condition had deteriorated so much he was put on a ventilator, which required sedation and the insertion of a breathing tube. Oh, yeah, once you get ventilated, that's not good. He eventually recovered and was discharged from the hospital last month, but he has since developed several issues, including phantom pains in one leg that require him to have physical therapy. The nerve in my foot is sending messages of pain to the brain, he said in the TV report Friday night. It causes me to limp because I feel that there's a wound there. He said, even though there's no discernible injury. He also has an altered sense of taste. The 24-year-old, who was a healthy basketball player, also now has high blood pressure and pulse rate and is on blood thinners that he might have to take his whole life. He also feels he's had a change in personality. I have less patience with people, he said, adding that he now frequently gets upset and finds himself angry over trivial things. I raise my voice over things that are not legitimate. Nonsense. All right. This is very concerning because this is showing that even in, well, he had a serious case, obviously, but even in people who had so-called mild cases, we've been building this data for some time now, that first off, the people who are serious, who have the critical cases, who have obviously the bilateral ground glass lung opacities and things like that, they very well may have lifelong lung impairment. The fibrotic damage to their lungs is just too much to overcome. It's not reparable. The other thing we're seeing, though, is more and more of these sorts of mystery ailments. This is mysterious to me. This guy's got a shooting pain in his leg. He's got loss of sense of smell. So clearly the nervous system is getting attacked here. Clearly this is attacking the blood system. In particular, it looks mostly like a coagulation disease more than anything else. But the anosmia, loss of sense of smell, plus the leg pains, the phantom pains, things like that, say it's possibly attacking the nerve tissue as well. And, of course, we have all sorts of issues around kidney stuff, liver function, all sorts of things. So this is a very, very serious disease. And for the people who are out there saying, well, the fatality is really low, that's, you just have to learn to live with a little extra fatality, no big deal, right? In fact, we have to understand what do we mean when we say recovered, because this person, Afik Suisa, clearly falls into recovered. There are lots and lots and lots of cases, hundreds and thousands of cases that I've been able to come across just like this, which the people would show up in the recovered column, but I don't think you and I would necessarily consider them recovered. So this is just my invitation to you to continue to take the honey badger virus seriously. You don't want it. You want to avoid it if you can. How do you do that? Wear a mask. Have everybody around you wear a mask. And if you're in a place where people aren't wearing masks, don't be there. All right. I think what some of this means is that we have to begin to learn to live with the risk of death again. I don't think we're going to get away with get rid of this COVID very easily. This was an interesting, I just pulled this one little snippet out from a pretty fascinating interview here with a Dr. Hazeltine Juan Guaido. This is at Danny Bott. Thank you very much for putting this to my attention here. So let's just listen in on this one part of this whole thing, because I think this professor, William Hazeltine, had a very good point of view here. Let's listen in.
So it's not a slight bump. It's 20,000 of our citizens, which means there are about 200,000 people walking around with active infections at any one time in the U.S., and they have been for a long time. So we have not controlled it. We are not controlling it. But that doesn't mean we're not going to reopen. We will reopen. And we're going back to a period at the beginning of my life when antibiotics were just coming in at the end of World War II for civilian use. Penicillin had been discovered. But before that, when we were building our railroads, when we were building our cities, we lived with a possibility that tomorrow would not come. Everybody knew that an infection could spell death. We're back to that era. And by the way, it's something that many of us predicted, that there would come a time, there would come a disease that would take us back to the pre-antibiotic days. The world doesn't end. Your world may end, but mankind goes on and economies go on.
I think that was a very good point. We're just basically back to the future here, and we now have among us a disease that we can't control. And that's how people lived for a very, very, for all of human history practically, except for this brief little window where antibiotics were able to rule the roost and give us a relief from spontaneous and bacterial infections, and we didn't really have these sorts of viral infections coming around that we now have. So we had a window there where I think people formed an idea that we could always be safe from this sort of infectious disease that could come and take you out. But Hazelton here is making the great point that this is just how things used to be, and we're getting back to that. So we're back to living with the risk of death there. I think that's a great point. I do want to just as well, I received several people sent this to me, which was another paper, and point of view by this guy, Dr. Ianetus. This is all him all by himself. Nobody's signing up this time to be a co-author on this particular article right here. Stanford's reputation is swirling and not upwards. It's swirling in a downward sort of a direction here. With every piece that this guy releases, I'm just very unimpressed with what Ianetus is coming up with here, and on an ongoing basis. But here's what I need to talk about. At any rate, he did a meta-study, looked at results of 23 different studies where they were looking at the seroprevalence, so they're doing the antibody tests. And so we're identified with usable data. I don't know what he means by usable data to enter into calculations. Seroprevalence estimates range from 0.1% to 47%. So 47% seroprevalence. Tell you what, John, you might want to toss that one out because that's ridiculous. I think 0.1% is probably ridiculous as well, unless that was some weird country that hadn't had any infections yet or something like that. But 47%, no, it's not happening. Infection fatality rates range from 0.02% to 0.86%, a median of 0.26%. And corrected values range from 0.02 to 0.78, a median of 0.25. So infection fatality rates of 0.25%. And among people under 70 years of age, infection fatality rates range from 0 to 0.26. I don't know who's got 0. Nobody gets 0. Sorry, John. With a median of 0.04%. So that's what people were sending around to me saying, hey, Chris, COVID's not that bad. It has a death rate, an infection fatality rate of 0.04%. All right, let's go back and just cover these terms again. I did this a number of months ago, but let's just, so we can all be on the same page, see what we got here. The mortality rate versus the case fatality rate versus the infection fatality rate. Those are three things. So first, the mortality rate is deaths from the disease divided by the total population. This is going to be the smallest number you can have because we're dividing the total population into deaths from disease, right? Whereas a case fatality rate is deaths from the disease divided by the total cases of people who are infected. So cases that are showing up in the hospitals. And if you have deaths from the disease divided by total infected, I'm going to have to change this right here, right now, because this should be our infection fatality rate. Yeah. So that's our infection fatality rate. And then this is deaths from cases, deaths from disease, total cases, because not everybody's a case. Okay. So these are total cases. All right, so now that I've got that all squared away. So we got our mortality rate, we got our infection fatality rate, which is going to be a slightly higher number than the mortality rate because now we're just dividing deaths from the disease, which is the same numerator here, by total infected. Total population, it's a much, much larger number than total infected. So if only half the population is infected, this is going to be half the size of that number up there, right? So if total infected is half the size of total population, this will be a half the size. So this will be a much larger number. And then the case fatality rate, deaths from the disease divided by total cases, this is going to be your highest number, right? So 1, 2, 3, this is your lowest number. This is going to be your medium-sized number here. And then this is going to be your highest number right here. And an example would be if we had 1,000 people in our population, 100 were infected, and 10 died, then our mortality rate would be the 10 dead divided by the 1,000. That would be 1%. Excuse me. Whereas if we had 10 dead and 100 infected, here we would have a 10% infection fatality rate. Okay? So just wanted to make sure we're clear on that because he's saying in this paper that there's going to be an infection fatality rate of about 0.04%. So time for some math. Here's some math. Let's get to it. What I've done here is I've taken the data that we have right now from Worldometers and just did a quick little spreadsheet table here. So I'm looking at here mortality. So what I've done for this table right here is I've taken the total deaths right here, for example, for the United States, and I've divided it by the total population of the United States, in this case around 320 million. And what you find is that the mortality rate here is about 0.04%. right? It's very low in a place like India, which has got 1.3 billion people and is just getting started. So that's very, very low number. But we see other places like the UK has a number like 0.06%, or Spain clocking in at 0.06%, right? And they're not even done with this disease at this point in time, right? So as they get more and more deaths racking up, this mortality rate's going to be going up. And again, this mortality rate is the lowest possible percentage you can possibly have in this story. And we're already seeing here that the mortality rates in major countries are already well over 0.04%, like France, right? Whereas what John was saying here in his paper, Ianetus, and by the way, there's a typo right there in the very first word. You want to fix that. You want to fix that right there. Scratch that. So to say that the infection fatality rate is only 0.04%, it's already higher than that. It's already higher than that on a mortality basis. In an infection basis, this would be very, very large number. So let's look at the case fatality rate here, which is our highest number. Look at these here. For the case fatality rate, I'm taking total deaths and dividing it by recovered plus total deaths on the bottom. Look at these numbers. 10.9%, 8%, 2.3, 5.3, 5.4, 15.8 here for Italy, 13.9 for Mexico, 28.4 for France. Oh my God. I mean, geez, look at these numbers, right? So these are the case fatality rates. So to suggest that it's a very, very low number is just not right. Again, this is junk. This is again another junk paper by Ianetus, and I'm very sorry, Stanford, but you may want to figure out how to rein that in, because this is just useless. But people are clinging onto it and taking it out there and saying, "Look, we don't need to wear masks and we can just get out in public because, gosh, look at those odds. I'll play those odds any day of the week." Gotcha. All right, but masks work. We now have a lot of data around that. The faster a country required masks, the fewer coronavirus deaths it had. That's a study that just came out. And some countries have been devastated and others have escaped lightly. Why the extreme differences? The main one is that the countries that quickly resorted to widespread mask wearing had far lower death rates and shorter outbreaks. A new study argues, I'm not sure if argues is the right word there. The authors looked at coronavirus death rates in 198 countries, trying to see why some had painfully high death rates, others very low. What we found was that one of the big variables you can control, which influenced mortality, was wearing masks, says Christopher Leffler of Virginia Commonwealth University. It wasn't just by a few percent, it was up to 100 times less mortality. The countries that introduced masks from the very beginning of their outbreaks have had hardly any deaths. Why? Because you have a lower inoculum, because you have a lower rate of spread, because your hospital system doesn't get overwhelmed for lots of reasons. So wearing masks works. Let's just say come on, people, get on with it. Can we just get to wearing masks, please, 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 please? All right. Remember last time I told you, grapes for them, cucumbers for us. I'm very concerned about the direction of things with the central banks now just printing money, throwing it into the markets, making the rich richer. And of course, I fight for fairness because I don't want to live in a failed state. I think that would be great if we could avoid that. It doesn't have to be this way. We can totally not do this way, but we're doing it this way for now. And of course, Jerome Powell is out there with his let them eat stocks sayings, and it's just awful. It's just awful right now. So I really wish we weren't going down this path, but here we are. I think there's going to be more social unrest as the summer spreads, and we're going to have more coronavirus cases. All right, here are my conclusions and summaries for today. The U.S. is mismanaging SARS-CoV-2, managing it poorly. Out of reserves, that's it. We're basically giving up. We're just at the shrug stage. Like, I don't know. People just get this thing. We don't know. And it's not that deadly, or whatever the story is to rationalize it. The D614G mutation is very real, confers higher infectivity and seemingly seriousness to this whole thing. That's what the China data is suggesting. And as well, it's entirely possible that people who caught and battled D614, which is classic COVID, might not be immune to D614G. More and more, we're learning that recovered isn't really recovered. And that's why I don't want to get this disease at all, if possible. And that means that now in this part of the story, this is when your vigilance counts the most. I know, It's hard to maintain all of the distancing and the changes to behaviors and wanting to get back to business and how things were. I totally get it. Believe me, I'm right there with you. But now is when you really want to make your vigilance add up and count for the most. It's super easy to be lulled into complacency here. It's easy to shrug. It's easy to give up. It's easy to say, oh, well, I'll just get it. And, hopefully I'll get the Math Plus protocol or whatever. We're learning ways to really treat this better. That's all true. But what we don't know is what happens after you've had this thing for a year or the second time you get it. Or are there long-term neurological consequences? Or is this thing burning slowly in people's bodies to erupt later at some point in time? We don't know any of that. And until we do, I think it makes the most sense to just avoid getting it in the first place, if at all possible. All right. Continuing, the U.S. Federal Reserve and other central banks, they're creating really dangerous social and cultural climate right now. I think the protests can really be explained against the backdrop of deep, deep structural unfairness. And remember, if you haven't seen this video, please watch this from last time, the update I gave last week on Thursday. Grapes for them, cucumbers for us. We're just wired to not like things to be unfair. So right now, the central banks, I think they're acting like cultural vandals. They are really, really risking everything. For what? For temporarily higher stock prices so they can feel better about themselves and their actions. It's really, absolutely, it's something that I just have no respect for. Zero respect for that, because it lacks all integrity in this story. So what am I going to say? You know what? It didn't have to be this way. We could wear masks. We could have given clear, consistent communication. We could have told people the same story over and over again so that we could nudge people from one set of behaviors into a new set of behaviors. The old set of behaviors, we were in condition, an unalert condition, so that, hey, you don't have to pay attention to anything, whatever. You just walk around. Sometimes you get the flu. Who cares, right? Now we have to go into a different condition where people are more armed, alert, aware of the armed with facts, or if you live in a city, maybe a gun. But I mean armed with data and information that will inform and change their behaviors, so that we now know that we can't shake hands and we've got to not touch our faces. We've got to wash our hands a lot. We've got to wear masks, things like that. Well, to have done that well, we would have had to have had leadership, not managers. And the leadership would have had to have been able to communicate that very, very clearly. All right. Moving on. Remember, if you want to get a t-shirt, these resilience t-shirts from Peak Prosperity, wonderful, all organic cotton, made in the USA kind of t-shirts. Feel good. This is my fiance Evie here, modeling that for you there, showing what it looks like when she's holding it out. This is us in our new garden. This is me planting some stuff that's monstrous now. It's really huge. And here's some people also modeling those resilience t-shirts right there. And remember, you want to get your immune system, the terrain of your body, as tuned as possible. Make sure you are taking your daily supplements around zinc, D3, quercetin. Those are going to be some biggies right there, and selenium. If you do get sick, you get that scratchy bit in the throat, remember, your elderberry syrup is going to be just a very important thing. I like this elderberry syrup right here. It's just fantastic. Great reviews. N-acetylcysteine, vitamin C. These all very important. And remember, resubscribe if necessary. Evie gets unsubscribed from my YouTube channel all the time, like pretty much every week. She's not subscribed anymore. I don't know why. YouTube and sometimes Twitter feel it's so necessary to unsubscribe people. But if you've been unsubscribed, please remember to just subscribe. You can hit the subscribe button right there, and then you'll get the notifications to know when the next video is out, and you can track us and follow us more easily. All right, with that, I am all done for today. I will see you next time. Thank you so much for listening. Be safe, avoid the honey badger virus, and remember, it didn't have to be this way.
Hi folks, Adam Taggart, co-founder of Peak Prosperity here with good news. In his daily videos, Chris often refers to the book that he and I wrote, Prosper, How to Prepare for the Future and Create a World Worth Inheriting. It presents a practical model for living with greater resilience, and those who read it and followed its advice were much better prepared for the coronavirus outbreak than the average household. Given its heightened relevance to the turbulent times we now find ourselves in, Chris and I want everyone to benefit from this book's formula for better, more secure living. So we're giving the book to you for free. To get your copy, simply visit peakprosperity.com/free book. We think you'll find this an extremely valuable and inspiring resource for the current COVID-19 outbreak and for being well positioned for any kind of crisis that comes our way in the future. Thanks for listening and happy reading.